Have you ever noticed how some nights begin like any other, yet carry a truth capable of tearing apart everything you believed your entire life? Nights that look ordinary on the surface, but hide a wound so deep it cuts through years of sacrifice, love, surrender, and faith? That's exactly what happened that night. And before I say anything else, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your state, your country. I want to see who's here with me, because this story doesn't belong only to me. It belongs to countless women in countless places, and I want to know if you've ever felt this same weight pressing on your chest. I'm going to tell you how everything began, but let me warn you, it didn't start with shouting or fighting or any kind of storm. It started with something far worse. It started with the kind of silence that exposes secrets, that shows who's really on your side and who's just waiting for the perfect moment to hurt you. A silence I already knew well, but kept pretending not to hear, because that's what mothers do. We pretend, we overlook, we convince ourselves that love can endure everything, until one day, love gets tired, and that night, mine reached the edge. I remember the exact moment I walked into the living room. The air felt too heavy, almost thick. It was as if the whole house was trying to warn me that something was wrong, something was about to happen, and I could no longer avoid it. And even though I tried to explain it away, deep down, I knew. That silence wasn't silence. It was a warning, a sign, a quiet announcement that I was about to face a truth I'd denied for years. And don't think that atmosphere appeared out of nowhere. No, it had been building. A small disrespect here, a sideways glance there, a smirk at the wrong moment, a comment disguised as a joke but sharp enough to cut. I had been collecting tiny hurts, convincing myself they were nothing. But little hurts gather, little hurts become wounds, and wounds ignored eventually rot. And that night, they were all open in front of me. My son was sitting on the couch, but he wasn't the boy I knew. He wasn't the young man I raised with calloused hands and a heart full of dreams. His eyes had changed. They were hard, cold, distant. Eyes that no longer remembered the mother who fought for him to have what I never had. Eyes that looked like a decision had been made long before I even opened my mouth. And the worst part? He wasn't alone. She was right, next to him, watching, waiting, as if she knew exactly what was about to unfold. I felt that tightening in my chest that only a mother understands, that instinct that pushes you back, that urge to run, to escape what's coming. But I stayed, because I still believed a conversation could fix it, that all I had to do was explain, speak softly, calm things down. I believed I could still reach my son, that the love I planted in him was still somewhere inside, even if buried. I just had to find it. But the moment I opened my mouth, I realized nothing I said would change what had already taken shape inside him. The way he answered me wasn't irritation. It was contempt, as if my words were bothersome, as if I were getting in the way, as if I no longer belonged there. And when a mother realizes she's lost her place in her own child's life, that hurts. But when she realizes she's lost his respect, that destroys. And she, his wife, watched everything, like someone watching a show whose ending she already knew by heart. No surprise, no shock, no empathy. Just that coldness that measures you, judges you, and discards you. A coldness that doesn't need a single word to wound. And that night, she was satisfied. I tried to end the conversation, tried to avoid conflict, but some people don't want peace. They want provocation. They want tension. They want to see how far you can be pushed. They want to test the limit of your pain. And he let himself be taken. That was the moment. The night turned into an abyss. I'm not going to rush through this because you need to understand every thread of this story before I tell you what really happened. But I can promise you one thing. What came next changed my life forever. And I want you to stay with me until the end, because what happened in that living room, many people live it behind closed doors and never have the courage to speak it out loud. And what came after, no one is ever truly prepared to hear. And that is exactly where this story begins to sink to its deepest point before rising again. Because the truth of that night hadn't even shown its full face yet. I remember every detail of the little boy who once fit completely in my arms, as if his entire world depended only on my warmth. I remember the nights when his sleep mattered more than mine, the mornings when I woke up 3, 4, 5 times before the sun, just to make sure he was breathing softly. I remember when he cried, and I could tell immediately. Why? Just by the sound. Hunger, colic, fear, or simply the need to be held. And I held him. I gave him everything. Because back then, he looked at me with those innocent eyes full of trust, as if I were the safest, strongest, most irreplaceable person in his life. And maybe I was. And maybe that's what hurts the most now, knowing that once I was everything, and suddenly I became nothing. Time passed, as it does for everyone, but on me, it left deep marks. I worked too hard, pushed myself even harder, did everything I could so he could have a life better than mine. And if you're a mother, you know exactly what that means. It means giving things up, staying quiet when you're exhausted, smiling when you're breaking inside. I did it so many times I lost count. And even then, every sacrifice felt worth it when I saw that shy smile of his, the way he hugged me after school, the spark in his eyes when he said, "Mom, look what I did." Those moments made me feel like I was getting something right, even when the world insisted I was failing. But time has a cruel way of showing us that not everything we plant grows the way we imagined. My son grew up, became a teenager, then a man, and slowly, painfully, I realized the sweet boy I knew was slipping through my fingers. At first, it was small things. He stayed out longer. He answered shorter. He didn't want to talk. I thought it was just a phase. Everyone says that. It's just a phase. But phases pass. That didn't pass. It became habit. It became distance. It became a wall between us. And when she entered his life, everything changed faster than I could keep up with. I'm not saying she came with open malice, but there was something in her, something in the way she spoke, the way she looked at things, the way she positioned herself between us. It was as if I were out of place, an uncomfortable reminder of the life he had before her. And slowly, what was ours began to shift, be moved aside, be replaced. My son, the boy who used to run to show me everything, now hid things from me. The young man who asked for my advice, who listened to me, who respected me, began acting as if my opinion was a burden, as if my presence was too much, and I tried not to think about it, tried to believe it was just adjustment, that relationships change, that mothers have to learn how to let go. But there is letting go, and there is losing. And what I lived wasn't change, it was loss. I lost conversations, I lost closeness, I lost space. I lost the right to be heard, until one day I realized I wasn't losing my son. I had already lost him. He just hadn't told me. He became more and more influenced, shaped by words that weren't mine, by thoughts that didn't match the way I raised him. I could see in his eyes that what he was becoming wasn't his essence. It was repetition. It was echo. It was someone else speaking through him. And even so, I tried not to see it, because accepting it was too painful. Accepting that the child you raised with so much love now looks at you as if you are a problem. That isn't just pain, it's silent betrayal. It's like watching a distorted version of him take the place of the real one. And I fought that feeling every single day. I kept trying to reach for that little boy who once held my face in his 2 tiny hands and told me I was his favorite place in the whole world. But that boy wasn't there anymore. And the man who took his place seemed to carry a coldness that was never born inside our home. That night, when I really looked at him, I recognized a stranger I had loved my whole life, a stranger I had raised with my own hands. And the cruelest part is that we only truly see these things seconds before everything collapses. It's not some vague feeling, it's certainty. It's your own body warning you that love is in danger, that the relationship has reached a point of no return, that something is breaking right in front of your eyes, and you have no strength to stop it because the crack has been there for a long time. I wanted to scream in that moment. I wanted to ask when exactly I lost my son. I wanted to know when his sweetness turned to stone, when respect turned into indifference, when the word mother lost its weight inside his heart. But I didn't, because mothers, even when they're wounded, still try to protect. So I stayed quiet, and that silence, that night, felt like a sentence being handed down. I knew whatever was coming next wouldn't be light, wouldn't be fair, wouldn't be easy to survive. And even so, I stayed there, because part of me still believed I could reach him, that somewhere, deep down, that sweet boy was still calling out for me. And if you're here listening to this, stay with me until the end. Because understanding how a child changes like this isn't just important for me. It's important for every woman who's ever given too much and received too little, for every mother who has loved alone, for every woman who has lost her place in the life of the person she loved the most. And if you're not subscribed to my channel yet, subscribe now. Don't put it off. Here you'll find stories that speak the truths so many people live, but almost no one has the courage to share out loud. You deserve to hear every single one of them, because some kinds of pain are impossible to walk through alone. Here, you'll never be left without a voice. Here, you'll find strength, comfort, and answers no one ever gave. You. Subscribe and stay with me, because what I'm going to reveal in the next part, you need to hear. The argument started over something so small that for a moment, I almost believed we could solve everything with a few calm words. But the atmosphere in that house was already set to explode. I felt it in the air, in the way he adjusted himself on the couch, in that crooked little smile on her face, so subtle it almost went unnoticed. Almost, because there isn't a mother in this world who doesn't notice when someone is standing next to her child, secretly rooting for the bond between them to fall apart. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone was enough of a provocation, a presence that fueled a kind of false courage in him, an aggression that didn't match who he truly was. And I saw it in the very first look he threw at me that night. A look that was too hard to be spontaneous, too rehearsed to be just irritation. It was almost like he was performing a role someone else had written for him. I tried to stay calm, tried to speak slowly, to explain what had hurt me, but he didn't want to listen. He didn't want a conversation. He wanted a target. And she watched as if she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. I spoke, and he cut me off. I tried to finish a sentence, and he sighed loudly, as if my words were too heavy, as if I was intruding on territory he now claimed as his. And every interruption from him was followed by a look from her that seemed to say, "That's right, keep going." I saw it, I felt it, and it was like someone was tightening a rope around my chest. When he stood up, I knew something was about to be lost for good. There was no softness anymore, no patience. He stood in front of me with an expression that didn't belong to the boy I raised, an expression too loaded to have appeared out of nowhere. I tried to breathe, tried not to respond at the same volume. But the calmer I became, the more agitated he grew. It was as if my calm made him angrier, as if my refusal to fight pulled him even further past the line. And with every word he threw at me, it felt like a piece of my story was being ripped out without any care. She stepped in for the first time with a short, almost casual sentence, but full of poison, just enough to push the knife a little deeper into the situation. She always does this. That's all. That was enough. He turned to me, as if that phrase were the pure truth, as if I had spent my whole life carrying this flaw that he was only now finally able to see. That sentence was the match. He started listing things that made no sense at all, half-remembered events, twisted stories, situations that never happened the way he claimed. I was in shock. It was like watching my son narrate a parallel version of our life, a version that wasn't ours, a version that sounded like it had been built word by word by someone who never lived a single day under the same roof as me. I tried to answer, tried to explain, but he wouldn't let me. He pushed me back with sharp words, as if I were an intruder in his life. I looked at him and could see the boy I knew trapped somewhere deep inside, screaming for help from behind this man who wasn't him. And it hurt. It hurt in a way I had never felt before. Because it's not just the argument, it's not just the anger, it's that feeling of realizing, for the first time, that your own child is capable of hurting you on purpose. When he slammed the cabinet door, the sound echoed through the whole house. That was when the atmosphere truly shifted. I felt respect being kicked out of that room, and she, always her, stayed leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, watching like it was a show. Like it was entertaining. That sent a deep shiver down my spine, the kind that cuts right through you. I finally saw clearly that the fight hadn't started there. That moment was just the result, the consequence. the fruit of a seed I never planted, but that someone else had been watering every single day while I pretended everything was fine. He started throwing memories in my face, memories that had never happened like that. He twisted facts, accused me of things that made no sense, things I never said, never did, never was. And the more he spoke, the clearer the distance between us became. A distance that wasn't born that night. It had only been revealed. I tried to touch his arm, just to ask for calm, but he pulled away like my touch was some kind of attack. I felt the weight of that gesture. I wasn't just hurt. I was witnessing the exact moment my son chose to believe rejection over the love I'd given him his entire life. I said his name, trying to pull back whatever was left between us, but he shouted. It wasn't just words he screamed pain, he screamed frustration, he screamed hurt that wasn't even his, wounds that were never born inside him. And in that scream, I felt myself losing him all over again. It wasn't just a fight, it was a breaking, a loud, violent snap of everything that had ever held our relationship together. The living room felt too small for so much tension. It was like the air got hotter with every sentence. I saw in him a mix of anger and vulnerability, as if he were fighting something inside he didn't know how to control. But at the same time, I saw in her eyes a quiet satisfaction. Not satisfaction in my pain, but in the distance growing between us. She wanted that distance. She needed it. And my son, blinded by his own fury, couldn't see it. When the argument reached its highest point, when he threw a sentence at me that I never imagined hearing from a child, I felt my heart stop for a second. It was like my whole body froze. I wanted to respond, to push back, to show him how wrong he was, but I couldn't. Not because I lacked strength, but because some words land like blows that knock the air out of your lungs, steal your voice, and shake your soul. All I could do was stand, there, still, looking at the man he had become and trying to find traces of the boy I once raised, traces that were fading, traces that maybe no longer existed at all. And while he kept going, while the argument slipped completely out of control, I realized that night wasn't about who was right or who was wrong. It was about loss, about rupture, about the silent pain you bury for years until it finally explodes right in front of you. And I know many women listening to this now have lived something similar, have felt the bitter taste of emotional injustice inside their own homes, have heard words that should never come out of a child's mouth, have found themselves in arguments where calm turns into helplessness and love becomes a weapon used against them. And many of these women still carry the weight of what they didn't say, the weight of staying quiet to avoid something worse, the weight of being treated as guilty simply for existing. If any part of this touches you, comment, "I know exactly how this hurts," or just write, "I didn't deserve that." You'll see you're not alone. And there's still so much of this story left to uncover because that night was just beginning. And what happened right after changed everything in ways I could have never imagined. When he took that one step closer, I felt something inside me break before anything even happened. It was like my body recognized the danger before my mind could accept it. He was so close, I could feel his heavy breathing, that mix of anger and wounded pride that wasn't born inside him, but now ran through his eyes as if it were absolute truth. I tried to speak, tried to ask for calm, tried to reach for the humanity I once knew in that little boy who held my face with tiny hands and trusted me with his entire world. But in that moment, there was no little boy. There was a man overtaken by a rage I had never seen before, a rage that didn't match the life we lived or the love we built. She was still there, silent, but it was a silence that screamed encouragement. She didn't move a muscle, didn't try to stop him, didn't try to step in. It was like she was watching a scene she had waited years to witness, like that moment was the confirmation of everything she wanted him to believe about me. And I realized, with a tightness in my chest that nearly stole my breath, that what was about to happen had nothing to do with the argument we were having. It was something old, something stored away, something he had been feeding inside himself, maybe without even noticing, while she shaped his view of me day after day. I said his name one last time with that tone only mothers have, that tone that tries to reach the emotional memory, the bond, the roots. But he didn't hear me. Or maybe he heard and chose to ignore it. Everything happened so fast that to this day, I don't know if I had time to close my eyes or if they stayed open the whole time, forced to witness what they never deserved to. See, all I know is that his hand came, and when it came, it didn't bring just physical force. It brought everything I feared, everything I avoided thinking about, everything I once believed could never happen. The slap wasn't a slap. It was a sentence. It was rejection. It was confirmation that I had lost my son long before that night, and the truth was only now revealing itself in the cruelest, most definitive way. The sound of the impact wasn't loud. It didn't echo like in the movies, didn't fill the house with noise. It was soft, muffled, almost discreet. But inside me, it felt like an entire wall had collapsed. I felt my body sway, but the pain didn't come from the skin. It came from the soul, a burning pain, a hollowing pain, a pain that seemed to squeeze the air from my lungs and crush my chest from the inside. I brought my hand to my face out of instinct, not to protect myself, but to confirm it had happened, to feel on my skin the moment my son crossed a line I never imagined he'd be capable of crossing. He stepped back after the slap, but not out of remorse. It was more like he was trying to understand his own strength, as if even he was surprised by what he'd done, but not surprised enough to apologize. He stood there, breathing hard, his eyes wide, trying to hold on to the anger that was already dissolving into something that looked like fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what that moment represented. And I saw, in the slight tremble of his hand, that he didn't even know how he had gotten to that point. But the problem is that this kind of late regret doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't heal the wound. It doesn't change the fact that he chose to hurt me in that second. She, on the other hand, didn't hide a thing. That tiny smile that showed up at the corner of her lips didn't last more than 2 seconds. But I saw it. I saw it, and it cut as deep as the slap. It was a faint smile, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning, as if she were saying, without words, "It's done. It's over." And in that moment, I knew that anything I tried to rebuild with my son from that point on would never be simple. Because he wasn't alone in that act of violence. She was right there with him, and that made the pain even heavier. I stayed standing because something inside me refused to fall. It wasn't pride, it was survival. I knew that if I sat down, if I collapsed, if I broke right there in front of them, I would lose something far greater. I would lose my dignity. I would lose my voice. I would lose the ability to look at myself without shame. So I stood. I stood with my hand against my face, feeling the heat rise through my skin, tasting the bitterness of a betrayal that didn't come from an enemy, but from someone I once carried in my arms. I took a deep breath to hold back the tears, not because I wasn't hurting, but because I knew that tear would be used against me. It would be seen as weakness, as manipulation, as drama. I knew that look in her eyes. I knew exactly how she would interpret my tears, so I swallowed the pain, swallowed the tears, swallowed the urge to scream. He tried to speak, but there was no argument left after that. His words sounded distant, disconnected, stripped of meaning. It was like the slap had made everything clear, revealing what had been hidden behind every sentence spoken that night. Accumulated resentment, intentional influence, emotional confusion, lack of maturity, absence of gratitude. Every inflection in his voice sounded foreign, as if I were listening to a rehearsed script, not real feelings. And the more he tried to explain, the clearer it became that he didn't even understand what he had just done. My face was burning, but the physical pain was nothing compared to what was happening inside me. The slap didn't just mark my skin, it marked my soul. It marked my story. It marked the boundary. And once that boundary is crossed, it never returns to its place. I looked at him, and for a moment searched for the boy I raised, searched for that gentle look, that connection that always existed between us. But he wasn't there. What stood in front of me was a man I no longer recognized, shaped by resentments that weren't mine, influenced by someone who made sure to place herself between us as a barrier, a filter, a shadow. I felt the air in the house change. It was heavy, thick, almost impossible to breathe. And in the middle of all that weight, something inside me began to awaken. Not anger, not hatred. It was a kind of clarity that only comes after a deep shock, a clarity that makes everything sharp and undeniable. The truth of that relationship showed itself completely in front of me, and I knew, in that instant, that nothing would ever be the same after that gesture. If this part stirs something inside you, leave in the comments. Some lines can never be uncrossed, because what happened after this was even more revealing. And that's when the night truly began to change direction. The silence that came afterward wasn't an ordinary silence. It wasn't the kind that brings rest or peace. It was a heavy silence, almost solid, one that seemed to take up space, fill every corner of the room, and hang in the air as if it had a life of its own. I stood there, feeling that weight pressing down on my shoulders as I tried to understand what had just happened. My breath stuck in my chest, like my body had forgotten how to function. I couldn't blink, couldn't move my hand, couldn't even swallow the saliva that dried in my throat. It was as if the world had stopped, and I was trapped inside a reality too harsh, too cruel, too cold to accept. His face was still there, just a few steps away, but it felt distant, as if he were standing on the other side of a cliff. He stared at me, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say, and for the first time I saw it clearly. He wasn't just confused, he was lost. Lost in feelings that weren't his, lost in speeches that were never born inside our home, lost in a borrowed anger that had just exploded all over me. And in the middle of that loss, he looked small, smaller than I had ever seen him, as if he were shrinking in front of his own conscience. But that realization didn't bring comfort. It brought more pain, because seeing his weakness only showed me how much I had been carrying alone for so long. She stayed exactly where she was, like she was part of the furniture. She didn't move a finger, didn't open her mouth, didn't make a single gesture. Her body was still, but her eyes said everything. She watched with a coldness that cut through me, with a tension in her shoulders that wasn't shock or horror, but the effort of someone trying not to show how much they wanted that scene to happen. There was no compassion, no guilt, no discomfort. Her silence was complicit. It was satisfied. And that sent a chill crawling up my spine, because in that instant, I understood that nothing I said would change the atmosphere in that room. No explanation would bring my son back to me. No attempt at conversation could rebuild what had been slowly torn down over time. I put my hand on my face, not to hide the physical pain, but to feel the reality of that moment. The palm of my hand met the heat of my skin, already starting to throb. And from that touch on, everything felt more real. It was like my body was slowly waking up from a state of shock. My blood felt like it was circulating again, bringing back that burning sensation, that internal alarm that something very serious had just happened. But the pain that burned in me had nothing to do with the slap. The pain came from understanding, from knowing that my son, the boy I had once protected from the world, had just hurt me in a way the world never managed to. I took a deep breath, or at least I tried. The air came in pieces, scraping my throat, choking me as if it were too heavy to breathe. The living room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in around us. The clock on the wall kept ticking, but time inside that room felt stuck, and in the slow rhythm of that broken breathing, I started to notice the details that had meant nothing just moments earlier. The curtain swaying slightly, the kitchen light flickering, his shadow stretched out across the floor. All those details hit my awareness like flashes, and in each one of them, I felt the same silent question burning inside of me. How did we get here? But I didn't ask it out loud. It wasn't worth it. Not in that moment. He was frozen, not knowing whether to reach out, to come closer, to back away. It was like the slap had opened a door he didn't know how to close, and I wasn't going to help him. Not this time. Because part of what broke me in that second was realizing that I had always tried to soften everything for him. I always gave explanations, always made excuses, always tried to understand, always tried to justify. But right then, I finally understood that none of that had worked. The love I had poured over him so generously hadn't found a place to live in his heart at that moment. The three of us stayed in silence, a triangle of shattered emotions, he shaking slightly, her solid as stone, me breathing carefully so I wouldn't fall apart. And in that silence, I began to hear things that had never been spoken. I heard the exhaustion of my own soul. I heard the weight of all the years I spent trying to be too good, too understanding, too available. I heard the disappointment that could no longer be hidden. And I also heard a whisper inside of me, a whisper saying that this was the beginning of something completely different, something I had never imagined facing, but that now stood in front of me like an unavoidable destiny. I looked at him again, trying to find any trace of clarity in his eyes that might still reach me. His gaze flickered between anger and guilt, like he was trapped between two forces, fighting for control. And for one brief instant, just one, I saw a spark of the boy I once knew trying to surface, but it went out too fast, and when it went out, I felt my chest sink, because there it was, the truth I didn't want to admit. My son was divided between the story we lived together and the story she had planted inside him, divided between the old love and the new influence, divided between who he really was and who she wanted him to be. That understanding opened up a hollow inside of me so big it felt like it echoed. It was the feeling of abandonment, not the kind where someone physically leaves, but the kind where the person is still standing right in front of you but left you a long time ago. It's the kind of abandonment that hurts even more because you can see the presence but feel the absence. And that emptiness is a pain that has no quick cure, a pain that spreads slowly, filling every space where hope used to live. The silence stretched on for long seconds, and I knew that moment was marking my spirit in a way I would never forget. And if you've ever lived through something that tore your soul without making a sound, write in the comments, "Silent pain destroys too," because this truth needs to be spoken by those who feel it. And it was there, in that paralyzing silence, that I realized that night hadn't shown me everything it was carrying yet. The violence had come first, but what would come after would change the entire structure of my life. Because after that slap and that silence, nothing could ever be the same. And even so, I stayed right there, standing with a strength I didn't even know I had, because I could feel that the night still had more to reveal, more to tear away, more to expose, and I needed to be fully awake for every second of what was about to happen next. I walked to the bedroom, as if my feet didn't belong to me. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the floor was trying to pull my body down, trying to stop me from moving forward. The living room stayed behind me, but its silence followed, clinging to my skin, pounding inside my head. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see what I already knew was happening. Him frozen, not knowing who he was. Her still, satisfied with the chaos. And me, walking down that hallway like someone walking inside her own emotional funeral. The house was dark, but it wasn't the darkness that scared me. It was the clarity, the painful clarity of understanding that everything I believed about love, motherhood, and respect had been torn apart in that room. When I reached the bedroom, the first thing I did was close the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't lock it. I just closed it, slowly, with a kind of slowness that carried more meaning than any scream. As the door clicked shut, I felt a wave of heat rise through my body, something between a sob and shock, but nothing came out. It was like I was trapped inside a body that refused to react. So I walked to the center of the room, and there, with no one asking, no one watching, no one understanding, my legs simply gave out. I dropped to my knees like someone surrendering, but it wasn't surrender to the pain. It was surrender to something greater than me. I placed my hands on the floor and felt the cold of it against my skin. And it was only when I felt that cold that I realized how hot I was inside, as if that pain had lit a fire that burned everything it touched. In the middle of that emotional combustion, I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to see better. Because there are things we can only truly see when we're not looking at anything. And there, on my knees, with my breath ragged, my mouth dry, and my chest aching, I started to pray. It wasn't a rehearsed prayer. It wasn't a pretty prayer. It wasn't a prayer filled with perfect words. It was a pouring out, a plea, a cry from the soul. I didn't speak loudly. My voice came out almost as a whisper, but every word carried the weight of a storm. I said I didn't understand. I said it wasn't fair. I said the pain was too much And then, as if something inside me already knew the answer wouldn't come from my questions, I asked for strength. Strength not to break. Strength not to return the violence I had just received. Strength to still see value in myself, even after someone I loved so deeply had tried to erase it. I asked for clarity. Clarity to understand the path ahead. Clarity to see beyond his anger. Clarity to recognize my own flaws without turning them into guilt. Clarity to know what to do once I got up from that floor. Because I knew I had to get up, but in that moment, getting up felt impossible. And deep down, I knew that only a spiritual answer could sustain me. So I asked for protection. I asked God to place his hand over me the same way I had placed mine over my son every time he was afraid of the dark. I asked for protection over my mind, so his words wouldn't become internal scars. I asked for protection over my soul, so the slap wouldn't tear away my faith in life, my faith in people, my faith in love. And as I prayed, I felt something shift in the air. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a vision, it wasn't a touch. It was a presence, a gentle weight, like something greater had entered the room with me, sharing that pain, holding my back as I bent forward. It felt like someone was reminding me that I wasn't defeated, that I was still alive, that there were still roots inside me. And that presence filled the room like a silent light that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. My breathing started to calm. The pain was still there, but it felt organized, as if I was finally understanding that the purpose of that night wasn't to destroy me, but to wake me up, to reveal a truth I had been postponing, to show me that loving someone doesn't mean accepting everything, that being a mother doesn't mean being sacrificed, that respect is not optional, and that understanding blended with my prayer as if the words I whispered weren't mine alone. And I kept going. I kept asking God to help me separate what belonged to me from what didn't, to help me return to the world everything that was never my responsibility, to help me walk with my head held high, even with a bruised heart. I felt my shoulders ease. I felt my chest open slowly, as if a gentle hand were lifting each weight that had been crushing me. My eyes began to sting, but this time it wasn't pain. It was cleansing. Tears rose slowly, like they were asking permission, and when they finally fell, they didn't burn like before. It was as if the crying carried away a guilt that was never mine, a sadness I had been storing without noticing, a fear that no longer made sense to hold on to. And for the first time that night, I could hear my own thoughts clearly. And what I heard wasn't weakness, it was a decision, a quiet but firm decision, one that wasn't spoken out loud, but echoed inside me with enough strength to change everything. From that moment on, I repeated that word within my soul, as if signing a private contract with myself, and it vibrated inside me like a secret that couldn't be revealed yet, but was already transforming everything. I remained on my knees for a few more minutes, letting the presence around me bring order to the chaos the violence had unleashed. And while the prayer kept flowing, I felt a new energy rising inside me, something between courage and peace, between strength and rebirth, a feeling that told me, without words, that I wasn't alone, that I had been seen, that I had been heard, and that from that moment on, I wouldn't walk in the dark anymore, even if the night had only just begun. If this part touched you in any way, write in the comments. Prayer is also strength, because what came after this moment, that was the true turning point of that night, and that's exactly where my story begins to change direction with no turning back. When the room finally settled into silence, after a prayer that felt like it pulled everything stuck inside my soul out into the open, I felt the air shift. It wasn't something I saw, it was something inside, a slow, deep movement, almost invisible, but it crossed through me in a way I had never felt before. It was like the silence in that bedroom wasn't the same silence from the living room. Out there, the silence was condemnation. In here, it was an answer. A silence so full of meaning that it felt like it was speaking without uttering a single word. I stayed there, still, on my knees, with my hands pressed against the cold floor, and realized my breathing had finally found a rhythm. It wasn't that short, desperate breath stuck in my throat anymore. It was a steady breath, coming in strong and leaving slow, as if teaching me how to exist again after the fall. and as I breathed, it felt like each part of my body was waking up, becoming aware, reclaiming its place. The physical pain lessened, but the clarity grew. It grew like light spreading in small waves, illuminating places inside me I had avoided looking at. I lifted my face slightly and felt a calm touch me from within. Not the calm of someone who forgot what happened, but the calm of someone who understood. Someone who finally saw the truth without filters, without excuses, without dressing it up to make it easier. And that clarity hurt, but not like before. It was a necessary kind of pain, like the sting of medicine entering the body to heal a deep wound. I began to realize that everything I lived through in that room wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of revelation, the beginning of liberation, the beginning of a new cycle I didn't even know I was ready to live. Because sometimes life only gives us answers when we no longer have the strength to cling to the lie. And my lie was simple: believing my son was still the boy I once carried in my arms, believing he still saw in me the woman who loved him through every phase of his life. But in that silence, I understood that this version of him no longer existed, and accepting that, despite how cruel it felt, brought an unexpected kind of peace. I ran my hands over my knees, trying to gather strength to stand, but before I moved, something inside me asked me to wait. And I waited, not because I was weak, but because I knew that moment was when my soul was being rearranged. It was as if God Himself were placing every piece in its rightful place, giving me not only strength, but understanding. And understanding is a powerful weapon. Understanding frees you from guilt, frees you from carrying other people's weight, frees you from the obligation of saving those who don't want to be saved. I felt an inner voice, not a literal voice, but a firm feeling, telling me that everything I had carried up until that point needed to be left exactly where it was, that I didn't have to hold anything that didn't belong to me, that I didn't have to justify what I didn't do, that I didn't have to beg for love, respect, or recognition inside a house that was no longer mine. And that message came with a softness that felt like a caress, yet with a firmness that felt like a command. Then suddenly, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't broken. I was being shaped. I wasn't being destroyed. I was being awakened. And that awakening began to take form as a warm energy rising through my chest, filling a space I thought would stay empty forever. It was as if my soul were pulling me back, reminding me of who I was before I lost myself trying to be everything for everyone. I felt a courage growing inside me, slowly, like a small ember you just know can turn into fire. A courage that had nothing to do with revenge. It was courage of choice, courage of direction, courage to look at my own life and finally say, now it's my turn. A courage that came hand in hand with clarity, and together they formed something I hadn't felt in a long time. Strength, real strength. Not the strength of enduring everything, but the strength of deciding you will no longer endure what you do not deserve. And in that clarity, I understood what I needed to do. Not because someone told me, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because my spirit was finally aligned with the truth. I knew that when I stood up from that floor, I would no longer be the same woman who walked into that room. I would walk out with a new awareness, a new posture, a new vision. And that had nothing to do with pride. It had everything to do with emotional survival, with dignity, with healing. I stayed there a little longer, letting the silence work inside me, as if it were organizing every thought, every pain, every need. And the more I allowed that silence to wrap around me, the more I felt peace growing. A firm peace, the kind that doesn't shake when the storm comes. A peace that seemed to whisper, you know the way. And that certainty gave me a sense of control I thought I had lost forever. My body still trembled a little, but it wasn't weakness. It was energy returning. It was life returning. It was the sensation of rebirth. I felt my spine straighten, my heartbeat strengthen, my eyes open with more clarity. And inside me, a phrase repeated in silence, persistent, powerful, as if it summed up everything that prayer had awakened. I came back to myself. That phrase echoed through every part of me. I came back to myself. And returning to yourself is the first step in any real transformation. If you've ever lived a moment where the answer came in the silence, right in the comments. I felt the shift, because what happened to me after that was what rearranged my entire story that night. And there was still so much to happen before morning arrived. When I finally felt my hands steady against the floor, I realized I was ready to stand. Not because the pain had gone, but because I understood that staying on my knees was no longer a sign of surrender. It was a sign of staying stuck. The prayer had cleared what needed clearing, exposed what needed exposing, and now the strength rising inside me wasn't quiet anymore. It was a strength demanding movement. I placed my hands on my legs, felt the weight of my own body, and slowly lifted myself up. But the moment I stood, I felt it clearly. I was not the same woman who had fallen there minutes earlier. Something in me had aligned. Something in me had awakened. Something in me had understood, once and for all, that I couldn't keep living as if that house were still my home. I took a deep breath, wiped my face with my fingertips, and felt the shift in the air. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled my mind. The shock still pulsed, but it no longer paralyzed me. And above all, the fear had lessened, not disappeared, but softened enough that I could finally see everything with clarity. It was as if, after the emotional storm I survived, I was now looking through a glass that, for the first time, was finally clean, where nothing was blurry anymore. My life, my story, my dignity, everything revealed itself, like a map I finally knew how to read. I walked to the mirror on pure instinct, and when I faced my reflection, I didn't see a defeated woman. I saw a marked woman, yes, but not a destroyed one. I saw a courage that didn't come from pride, but from truth. I saw a firmness that didn't come from rebellion, but from decision, and that gave me a presence I had never noticed in myself before. It was as if my face carried the shadow of pain, but also the light of a new awareness. I touched my own reflection, and in that gesture, I realized that the only person left for me to save that night was myself. So I walked out of the bedroom. The hallway felt narrower than before, as if the house itself were trying to push me away. But this time, I didn't hesitate. Every step had intention. Every step had weight. I knew exactly what I was going to do. Not because I had planned it, but because after that prayer, the answer felt so clear it was like it had been written inside me. And when I approached the living room, the same silence that once suffocated me now felt small compared to my resolve. He was sitting on the couch, hands clasped together as if trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. The aggression in his eyes was gone. Now he looked disoriented, torn between what he had done and what he now knew he couldn't undo. She was still rigid, but the confidence she had carried earlier seemed shaken. Maybe because, for the first time, she didn't know how I would respond. Maybe because the posture I carried into that room didn't match the version of me she had tried to build in his mind. I stopped in front of them. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to shout. I just spoke. And when I spoke, my voice came out steady. A steadiness so solid, it felt like it came from somewhere deeper than my throat. It came from my soul. I told them I wasn't staying, that this house was no longer mine, that our relationship had crossed a line that had no return, that I would no longer carry a guilt that wasn't mine, nor try to fix what they had broken together. I said I wasn't an object to be pushed, nor a culprit to be pointed at, and as I spoke, I saw shock and desperation growing in his eyes. He tried to stand up, tried to say my name like that would be enough to stop the bleeding from the wound he himself created, tried to reach for my arm, but I stepped back, and that single step, small in distance but enormous in meaning, broke years of emotional dependence. It broke years of frustrated expectations. It broke years of swallowed silence. It broke the belief that a mother must accept everything, swallow everything, endure everything. That step was the moment I left behind the version of myself who survived, but never truly lived. He begged me to wait, and for the first time, his voice carried no anger, no accusation, no contempt. It was the voice of a lost little boy. But that boy was no longer my responsibility, because at that moment, I finally understood something that took years to make sense. Loving a child does not mean destroying yourself for him. Loving a child does not mean allowing him to hurt you. Loving a child does not mean accepting that he repeats wounds that never belong to you. There is a limit to love, and in that moment, I had found mine. She tried to speak, trying to regain control of the situation. She said something about not needing to exaggerate, but when I looked at her, she looked away. For the first time, she looked away. Because she knew. She knew the woman standing before her wasn't the same woman who walked into that house full of hope. She knew the emotional power she believed she had over me no longer existed. And in my eyes, she found the certainty that nothing she said could change the decision already made inside me. The decision was simple. I was leaving. But the simplicity of it didn't lessen its weight. It was a decision that cut ties, that ended cycles, that freed old wounds, that took apart entire emotional structures. But it was also the only decision that offered me dignity, the only one that gave me my voice back. The only one capable of pulling me out of the emotional prison I had placed myself in without realizing it. I turned my back on both of them, and the feeling I had between the living room and the door was indescribable. It felt as if each step erased a bit of the pain, a bit of the humiliation, a bit of the guilt I had always carried alone. It was like I was crossing a threshold between the woman who suffered and the woman who was reborn. The door was closed, but when I placed my hand on the doorknob, it felt like I was touching my own future. And before leaving, without looking back, I said the final words of that night. And that sentence, when it left my mouth, didn't tremble, didn't waver, didn't plead. It was a verdict, a liberation, a promise. And as the door opened, I knew my life was opening with it. I didn't need to look back to understand that night had closed a cycle I had carried for far too long. The door shut behind me with a blunt sound, but inside me, something opened so deeply I didn't yet know how to name it. I walked down the street as if I were relearning how to use my own legs, because there's a kind of strength that doesn't arrive with shouting, but with awareness. And that night, the awareness that came over me felt like a revelation. Not the kind meant to frighten, but the kind meant to free. I felt the wind hit my face, and for the first time in a long time, that wind didn't feel like it was pushing me backward. It pushed me forward, as if the world itself were saying, this was the step you were missing. This was the step you never had the courage to take. As I walked, I realized my body wasn't trembling anymore. My hand no longer hurt. My chest no longer burned. The weight had stayed behind in that house that no longer belonged to me. And when I realized that, I understood something that changed the way I see love forever. Some pains don't come to destroy you. They come to wake you up. And waking up is sometimes the bravest act a woman can do. I got home without looking at anyone, without thinking about what he was doing in that exact moment, without imagining whether she was saying something to ease his conscience. None of that mattered anymore. I was no longer tied to what was left behind. I was fully inside myself. And when I entered my home, I turned on a single light. I looked around with new eyes, the table I always cleaned in a hurry, the couch where I cried silently so many times, the floor where I once kneeled to beg for strength. Everything looked different, not because it had changed, but because I had changed. I went to the mirror not to look at the mark of the slap, but to see the mark of the woman who was born that night. The reflection wasn't fragility, it was rebirth. It was like seeing myself for the first time after years of trying to fit into silences that never belonged to me. And when I touched my face, I felt a truth so powerful it almost escaped through my eyes. I was forgiving myself for staying quiet for so long, for accepting less than I deserved, for confusing love with sacrifice, for believing motherhood meant having no boundaries. But now I knew. Boundaries are love. Boundaries are teaching. Boundaries are protection, even from yourself. I sat at the edge of the bed and let the silence take over. But it was a different silence now, a soft silence, where every second seemed to say, I exist, I matter, I have value. And in that calm, I felt gratitude rise inside me, not for what happened, but for what came after. I understood that the pain of that night was the last pain I ever needed to accept in order to free myself from all the others. It was the final period of a story I didn't need to carry alone anymore. And when I understood that, a peace so deep settled over my shoulders, it felt like an embrace. Not a human embrace, an embrace from destiny. I looked toward the window and saw the sky changing colors, announcing the end of the night. And that change outside seemed to speak to the change happening inside me. It was as if dawn were arriving at the same time I was dawning within myself. A soft light slipped through the glass, and I let it reach me, illuminating everything that had once been hidden. And in that blend of light and silence, I felt forgiveness arriving too. Not a sugary forgiveness pretending nothing happened. A mature forgiveness, a conscious forgiveness, a forgiveness that doesn't erase the wrong, but frees you from the pain it caused. I understood that forgiveness wasn't going back to what hurt me. It wasn't opening the door for the story to repeat. It was exactly the opposite. Forgiving was closing the door from the inside. It was choosing that the past would no longer control my future. It was looking at my own life and saying, from here on, I take care of myself. I honor my story. I put myself at the center of my own life. Because when a woman decides to return to herself, the entire world around her must rearrange. I stayed there, feeling that strength grow inside me, and I realized it wasn't just strength. It was faith. Not faith in the one who hurt me, but faith in God, faith in the path, faith in the restart, faith in the woman I was before the world tried to break me, and faith in the even stronger woman I was becoming from that moment on. I understood that life had brought me to that point not to punish me, but to lift me higher. And I accepted that elevation with my head held high, with a steady heart and a resolved soul. And that's why, when I think about that night now, I don't remember the slap. I remember the turning point. I remember the moment my soul said enough. I remember the exact second when the self-love that had been quiet for so many years finally found its voice. Because transformation doesn't happen when pain arrives. It happens when we choose not to stay inside the pain. And that decision, that's the one I made with every ounce of strength I had. The woman I became after that night wasn't born from the wound. She was born from the healing, born from the courage of looking at her own story with honesty, born from the faith that held her when strength failed, born from the truth that finally pushed through everything she'd been hiding from herself. And that woman, this woman, doesn't get lost again. She doesn't shrink. She doesn't beg for respect. She doesn't fold herself to fit into anyone else's life. She walks with firmness, with light, with awareness, and with dignity. And I hope that by hearing my story, you find that strength within yourself too. Because every woman has a turning point. Every woman has a moment when she understands she deserves more. Every woman has a night that awakens her to her own greatness. And now that you're here with me, with your heart open and your soul touched by this journey, let me tell you something. There's another video waiting for you on the screen. A video about another woman, another story, another pain, another kind of strength. It's not a continuation of this one, but it carries the same essence, the same truth, the same soul that turns wounds into wisdom. Watch it now. It will give you exactly what your spirit is asking for in this moment. Because here, in the Matriarch Secrets, every story is a key, and the next one might be the key you need today.